Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar today, Looking Inside Digital Higher Education, a Self-Assessment Guide for Institutions. We're really happy to see so many of you with us here today. Without further ado, I'm just going to crack on and go through some of the housekeeping rules of this webinar platform so that you know how to interact with us today. Next slide, please. So there are three ways of using this platform. First of all, we have the chat. So this is where you can greet one another, and we would invite you to do that straight away. Let us know who you are and where you come from. If you have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat. Or if you have any other remarks you'd like to share, you can also do this in the chat. However, if you have any questions for our speakers, we would ask you to put them in the Q&A box. They'll first of all be approved by our communications team and then published. We will try to answer as many as possible live during the webinar, but if not, you might see a written response underneath your question. And finally, there will be a poll during this webinar. It's also on the right-hand side, and it will be launched shortly. We'll let you know when it is. And once it's launched, we would invite you to answer it, but it will stay open for some time during the webinar. So you're here today to learn a little bit about the Institutional Self-Assessment Guide on Digitally Enhanced Learning and Teaching. However, this MOOC was actually developed as part of the DIGI-HE project, and my colleague Mhichíl Gaebel from the European University Association is going to let you know a little bit about the DIGI-HE project and about our desk research and our inventory report on institutional self-assessment instruments. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Mhichíl Gaebel.
And good morning, everybody. It's always heartwarming to see so many people from across Europe coming in here. Really good to meet you all. I will tell you a bit about the project, but first of all, also why we did this project. So it's a 3-year project which ran from January to December 2022, and then we extended it to 23 with a lot of partners and associates. You see it here listed. And the objective was, or is still, to strengthen strategic approaches for digitally enhanced learning and teaching, which we call abbreviated DELT, and to encourage self-reflection and capacity building. Now, how it came to this project, in 2018-19, we realized that EUA actually offers so many initiatives for learning and teaching. We have the annual Learning and Teaching Forum, which we just had in Bilbao 2 weeks ago. We have thematic peer learning groups. We have a lot of discussion on learning and teaching with members, but also at policy levels in the context of the European Union and in the Bologna process. And at the same time, there's also quite a bit of, at least anecdotal evidence of growing uptake of digitally enhanced learning and teaching, so DELT. But strangely, the two never really came together. So we saw that on one hand side, we have discussions on learning and teaching, and on other events, we discuss digitally learning and teaching as if these two were completely separated. So then we thought, is there something wrong with mainstreaming, that maybe many things are tried out at institutions, but they don't get into mainstream? And then we started to think, how can we support discussion, but also a process of capacity building at institutions? And evidently, if you want to do anything in digitally enhanced learning that goes beyond your classroom, you need a strategy, and you probably also need to know and understand a bit better what is actually happening at your institution. It's complex, it can be quite costly. You need to, what you try to change there also changes the institutional culture. So you need a strategy, and you probably have to do some self-assessment. And when we looked at the questions that an institution should ask itself, we said, despite the fact that institutions are quite diverse and different, the questions that they have to ask themselves are probably very much the same. So this is why we got the idea, would it be good to have a kind of self-assessment tool which would provide a standard approach on how to do that. And this is what the project then took on. And I show you a few of the activities. Well, this thinking was in 2019, and in 2020 we started the project, and then things changed, of course, very quickly, also due to the COVID crisis. This we couldn't foresee, and it had some impact on our project, but it didn't change it totally. The first thing that we did was actually we run a survey report which created some data on institutional, on the stage at which institutions are on learning and teaching. So we did this through a questionnaire and got good responses from 48 countries across Europe, more than 300 higher education institutions. That was also interesting because we had already done in 2013 a similar survey. So this created some longitudinal data. And then we thought of how to take it forward and how to understand better what institutions actually need. And so we created these thematic peer learning groups on digitally enhanced learning and teaching. We didn't actually have to create them. We had the peer learning groups already were in use by EUA as a standard offered to members. But we had them then specifically on digitally enhanced learning and teaching, which before, as I mentioned, was hardly ever addressed in these groups. So we brought together vice rectors, leadership from higher education institutions in smaller groups, and they worked with each other for about 9 months. Usually they do this through 3 physical meetings, but in this project, due to the COVID crisis, we did it online. And this is also how we continued it still in 2022. So we had 2 rounds of this. And then we tried to assess about what digital self-assessment tools were actually already available. We knew about some of them, but we didn't really know how many there were, and also knew very little about them. And I'll tell you in a minute more about it. And then we had a workshop series on self-assessment tools. And then the last thing, and this will also be the last part of the webinar today, we created a massive open online course on institutional self-assessment and self-assessment tools. So 2020 was for sure the year of surprises. I mentioned that already. COVID, nobody thought about it before, and suddenly digital learning and teaching was very popular. The other surprise that we found is then when we started to look for self-assessment instruments for digitally enhanced learning processes at institutions, we found actually that there were many more than we thought. We found close to 30, and in the end we decided not to create yet another tool ourselves, but rather to provide a bit of consumer information, so to assess the tools and review them and give institutions an idea what this is, what the tools are about and how they could be used. So we looked at purpose, the features, the resources needed, conditions to be fulfilled, also whether the tools had a theoretical perspective, and but we also tried to identify strengths and limitations. And here you see a long list of tools. I don't know if they are familiar to you. I mean, you probably heard about HI Innovate. Maybe you also know a few of the others. We actually put up now on the right side, I think, in your screen, a poll question where we ask you on whether you have actually ever used tools yourself, such tools yourself. So the question should come up very soon, and you have some time to answer it. Okay, I showed you already, I said already that 23 tools were reviewed. That was in 2020. But since, as you can see, there have been more tools published, which is really interesting. So there is actually an interest in these tools, at least among those who develop the tools. What are self-assessment instruments for? Well, first of all, they can be very different in purpose and also in the key themes that they address. what you see here, like policy and governance, questions of strategy, funding, infrastructure, curriculum and assessment, issues regarding staff and student support, and often also quality assurance. These were kind of standard features that we found in about all the tools that we looked at. And then what they can actually do for your institution, they can be a way of how to collect data and evidence in the institution. So a bit of statistical data, but I think more importantly, even get a feedback also from different parts of the institution, from staff and students, how they see digitally enhanced learning and teaching, and what are their needs and what works for them, and of course also what doesn't. So it helps you to do this review and then also discuss some ideas or concerns, lessons learned, and identify also the challenges and the opportunities that your institutions might see. And through that you can, and this is often not included in the tools, but this I think you would have to add, is you should not just look at the data and say that's it, but you have to somehow to bring that into the discussion. And we looked also in the workshop, and Alison will talk about this, on some concrete cases of how institutions have done that. So build a kind of process in which they involved not only institutional leadership, not only the colleagues from the who are in charge of digital structures and processes, but involved also students and staff at large. And then the other possibility that you can have is, if you happen to find another institution which uses the same tool, then you can actually do some benchmarking and compare and learn from each other. What exactly you do with the tool depends a bit on the individual tool. Most of them support strategy development and enhancement. They might give you a first reflection on digitally enhanced learning and teaching, and could also involve some external reviewers. And they can help you then to develop some guidance and identify good practice, and through that develop a strategic approach. So I should see now the results of the poll, or I think you can see it all. We have 13 said that they use such tools, 45 no, do not know, and 38 said that they don't, but that they would be interested. And that's kind of interesting because, as you can see here, that matches about the outcomes that we also had in our Europe-wide survey that I mentioned when we started the project, that there was actually a very limited take-up of these self-evaluation or self-assessment tools. We had only 12% who said that they had actually used it, though a larger number was interested to do that. So limited awareness. And we have been discussing a lot what are the reasons. And there are some very mundane reasons probably. So like the lack of staff and financial resources, because obviously if you want to run such a self-assessment tool, you can't do this just by one man or woman. You need to involve colleagues at the institution, and that takes time and might take some money. So I should say that most of these tools are actually for free. And then, of course, also a lack of time. And this is what we experienced also then in 2021, 2022. I think many institutions would have benefited from an institutional self-assessment or an institutional review, but it was simply not a good moment because things had to change so quickly due to COVID, and the situation was so unpredictable that there was not a good moment. But also now in these post-COVID times, we think that in many institutions, there's the feeling that we do this one day, but it's not a good moment at the moment to assess really, and then to rethink our strategy and act upon that. And it might also be a lack of know-how and not really knowing what to do with the results then. And here I hand over to Alison then, and she tells us a bit more about the experiences that we had in the workshop series that we did on self-assessment. And by the way, you can ask, of course, questions in the Q&A section, I guess. Alison, is that right?
Yes,
And
indeed.
we will stop at some stage and answer questions.
Of course, yes. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Mhichíl and I will answer them just after my short presentation. Thank you very much, Mhichíl, for your presentation, and actually really interesting to see that the poll results from the webinar actually matched pretty much exactly the survey results on the use of self-assessment instruments. So as Mhichíl said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the three-part workshop series that we ran following this desk research phase and the publication of the inventory report on self-assessment instruments. So we ran a three-part workshop series entitled Developing a High-Performance Digital Education Ecosystem. So the three workshops were spread over the course of 1 year, and each had a specific theme. What we wanted to really do in this workshop series was to provide institutions with some concrete case studies of institutional experience with these self-assessment instruments. So we provided 3 case studies, and they actually came from our partner institutions who are in the DIGI-HE consortium. And before each of the workshops, we sent a pre-recorded video message outlining their experience with these self-assessment instruments. So in the 3 cases, the instruments used were the ACODE benchmarks, DigComp.org, and then e-Excellence. So this proved to be a very interesting approach. It was a flipped approach, so the participants watched the videos beforehand. They found out about the tool used, the experience actually implementing a self-assessment exercise with the use of such an instrument, some of the challenges that the institutions came up against, how they actually overcame these challenges, what they did with the results. So really a very practical workshop, and also there were breakout groups where the participants could discuss some of the benefits of using such instruments and some kind of concrete steps to take just to get the ball rolling. The case studies then were really the chance to discuss the benefits of using these self-assessment instruments. So one of the first, let's say, main benefits was just the possibility actually to take stock of where the institution stands in terms of digitally enhanced learning and teaching through a structured approach. So not just an ad hoc approach, but really a structured approach with the use of such an instrument. And also the potential, but not the obligation, to align this exercise with QA processes, which actually gave the process some status and credibility, shall we say. The instruments were also a real kind of, let's say, community building tool. So they brought together various strands of the university community who might not always meet. So this included leadership, maybe QA professionals, all types of staff, ranging from teaching staff to international office staff, for example. And it also included students, so current students and former students. And bringing everyone together with this common goal actually turned out to be very motivating, and it boosted staff and also student buy-in regarding the development of DELT and the improvement of DELT within the institution. And as Mhichíl mentioned earlier on, some of the frameworks and tools, these instruments, actually encouraged institutions to share their results with others, so like a benchmarking exercise, which proved to be very useful. And some of them also offered an external evaluation as a follow-up, which was also deemed to be particularly useful. So as I said, the workshop series really aimed to be a very practical activity for those who took part, and the case studies and the panelists offered some considerations for using such self-assessment instruments. So the panelists underline the importance of knowing why you're carrying out such a self-assessment exercise. So what are your priorities? And does it relate to other reviews that are taking place in the institution? They also discuss the importance of choosing the right instrument. So this can be a very difficult choice to make because there are really very many tools and frameworks out there. So it's important to really look at what dimensions are covered by the instruments, and to choose one which really matches the priorities of your institution. So again, you need to be clear on your priorities and the areas you wish to evaluate beforehand. And also it's important to be aware of the fact that sometimes the terminology can vary from one instrument to another. So take this into account when you are looking for an instrument. So how to do it, how to get the ball rolling? Well, it's really important to involve major stakeholders within the institution, and to be aware that, as Mhichíl said earlier, it can actually incur quite significant human resources. So I think the panelists said that sometimes 20 evaluators were needed to actually undertake this self-assessment exercise. So some organisation is required. It can be time consuming, of course, if you want to do it well from beginning to end. It can take on average about 6 months. So it is a rather involved undertaking, and there are some costs involved. So maybe the instrument that you choose might be fee paying, or maybe it's not, but you need to hire people to conduct focus groups, for example, as a part of the self-assessment exercise. So all these things need to be taken into consideration before embarking on the self-assessment exercise. And then, yes, of course, the outcomes. So, what do you do with the results? Are the results clear? Are you going to use them to revise your strategy on digitally enhanced learning and teaching? You might need an action plan or a toolkit to help you here. And the importance of follow-up to make sure you're monitoring the implementation of your results. But all this is actually included in the MOOC that is going to be presented in just a few moments. So that's about it for me. I just have one more slide on the feedback from the workshop participants. So next slide, please. Yeah, so what we discovered was that there was let's say a lot of eagerness among the participants to follow up on this and to really conduct a self-assessment exercise using an instrument in their institution. But in fact, sometimes people's hands are tied, and it really does boil down to getting the go-ahead from your leadership to be able to take on such an exercise. But definitely the motivation is there, so that's good to see. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to see if there are any questions in the Q&A box. Don't be shy, please do share. And Mhichíl, you can come back on the screen. So we have two questions. I think that either me or Mhichíl could answer them. So is the self-assessment tool already available online? Could you please share the link? Yes, so Mairéad will tell you about it's actually not a self-assessment tool that we produced as a part of this project. It's a MOOC, which guides you through, let's say, the self-assessment process, but it is already available, and you can sign up for it, and we will be providing the link in just a moment. But other than that, I can't see any other questions.
No, it's probably for clarification, Alison.
Yeah.
We did a report, and I just had also posted the link to it. We did a report on self-assessment tools. So if you are interested in self-assessment tools, this is something that you might look at. And then in addition to that, I think the MOOC that Mairéad will present in a minute gives you a more practical take on self-assessment instruments or tools.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think we can stop there, Mhichíl, if that's okay, and I think we can invite Mairéad Mhichíl from Dublin City University to the floor. And Mairéad is going to tell you about this MOOC that we produced as a part of the project, and the main reason, I'm sure, why you are attending this webinar. So over to you, Mairéad.
Thanks very much. And I might just get the next slide to come up. I'm delighted to be here on a very lovely St. Valentine's Day, and hopefully the start of spring for lots of people around Europe. So we go to the next slide and look at the initial why we designed this MOOC and why it was important. So basically, we designed this MOOC. We had a number of objectives in play, and part of that was with respect to to bring together all of our activities of the DIGI-HE project and to really get them together there and to provide an opportunity, because we know how important it is to have an opportunity to interact with peers around a particular topic. And therefore we designed that MOOC. We designed this MOOC with that in mind, I should say. So really, if we go to the next slide, we wanted to, and you can see there's a lovely QR code coming up on this slide, and we wanted to highlight the project output. So the reports and the learnings that we have from our workshop series, we've included them in the MOOC so that they'll be easily available and be able to draw upon there. The MOOC is available currently and will be available for the foreseeable future, and you can access it through the QR code, etc. So again, it was really there to share institutional and practitioner experiences, taking a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the questions that will come up, but also giving the opportunity for learners and participants in the MOOC to bring up their issues, their contexts, etc. And from that, hopefully to build a community of professionals across the globe. Really, really important to engage in this, as I've engaged a digital assessment myself with a number of universities using some of these frameworks. And I think that having somebody or having a peer community, a network that you can draw on when you engage with digitally enhanced learning and teaching self-assessment is really, really important, because we all have our own institutional context, but we can learn from each other, and we can therefore hopefully shortcut some of the issues for your institution in that. And there's particular aspects that we drill into from the variety of case studies that we go into, whether it's DCU's focus on particular elements such as stakeholder engagement and getting the community to talk, or whether it's looking at the dichotomies that arise from how do you manage, a cohort of people who are very ahead of the pack with respect to digitally enhanced learning engagement, and bringing other people along within your institution. We talk about some of those tensions, inherent tensions in that. If we go to the next slide, please. So how we designed the MOOC anyway is really to do with trying to achieve these learning outcomes and objectives. So really to talk about why you should do this, with a focus on digital education in the evolving landscape. Mhichíl has referenced, we didn't expect COVID to come down, but COVID has given us an opportunity to think about this in a wider frame. And it's also given a little bit of it's acted as a catalyst for institutions to look at how they're engaging with their digital. So moving from that initial emergency remote teaching perspective now into a more considered aspect of what digitally enhanced learning and teaching means. And also looking at the strategic, because lots of institutions learned so much through the COVID pandemic when they were put, as we say here, necessity is the mother of invention. So that provide them with some sort of impetus to go through a digital transformation. It mightn't have been the best or the most comprehensive experience that they would have engaged, or most planned out experience. But indeed, that emergent strategic engagement is really, really important. So how can we use self-assessment to reflect on this and project and move and strategize for the future? Looking how different institutions can also effectively apply this, I think we thought were really, really important. And then, as Mhichíl and Alison have referred to, there is a plethora of resources out there already. We have differentiated them, some of them in our reports, and we said one does this, one does etc., and categorize them. That's available, but to understand what if you're going to use these tools, which tool most makes sense for you, or is it a combination of tools, and is it something that you develop within your own institution potentially to bridge the gap that there are in these tools, because no one tool is perfect or all-encompassing. Each comes with a different frame. A lot of them are really, really good as part of initial process to get you into a process of filtering down exactly what your objectives are. So thinking about that is really, really important. And then from that, within the MOOC that we have, it's thinking about how institutions should start that process of getting their own roadmap. And again, not trying to move away from a single snapshot sort of review of the institution, but going through a process by which you can gather data, get in data for the specific objectives that you have is a really, really important aspect. So we might just move to talk a little about what is in the MOOC itself. So the MOOC itself is designed really to look at the self-assessment and context at the week one. And we go in and we explore that, and it sets the scene of DELT. taking in all of these sort of strategic drivers, taking in the outside context, etc. And then the second part of it, we get into that deep dive at looking at the experiences. And we take 4 experiences. We take 3 from DIGI-HE partners, and then we take 1 from the Open University in the UK as well. And that's an important aspect as well, taking in that broader aspect, particularly for institutions who are more digitally, maybe their business model, their operational model has been around that, so that we can learn from those that are a little bit more advanced in these areas. Might just move to the next slide, please. So who is this aimed at? Well, we're aiming it at, and we've aimed it at, a broad church of individuals within institutions. But those people are the people who are generally involved in self-assessment, about guiding it, about framing it, and by understanding why it's important. So really to get these people involved and to get them to ask the questions, and particularly because, you know, this may be part of their own institutional practice, whether they're managers in particular units who are involved with digital innovation or related to teaching and learning, or perhaps they're involved with quality assurance. And we know that there's been a lot of talk about digital benchmarks for learning and teaching over the while. And indeed, here in Ireland, we're doing a review of our own quality benchmarks for digitally enhanced teaching and learning, which again is just shows you that of the amount of things that are ongoing. And again, then for the senior educational leaders, we all know that there has to be, or there should be, buy-in from the top if a lot of these, if it's going to be impactful. And that's one of the key learnings. You know, some of these initiatives can be done from the bottom up, but actually having top down or having institutional buy-in at the senior levels is really, really important to ensure that progress can be made on into the future. And that can be designed. So we go to the next slide, please. So our development cycle was really, really key in this. And what we tried to do was work together as a consortium of institutions who are involved in this, researching in it, but also as a wider consortium, taking in a variety of institutional perspectives. So taking that iterative approach to teaching, to designing is really, really important. And it was part of, I think, one of the reasons why when we came back, we had multiple iterations around content, around steps, around activities, just so that we could try and best frame it to what would suit and what would be accessible, but also useful to those who would engage in this MOOC, which is a really, really important aspect, so that when you go on for it, you're getting value for the time that you invest in it. And of course, like any short course, it's a self-paced study, you know, so therefore you decide about the amount of time that you can set aside for it. But we've put indicative times there with respect to how much time we think that will take you to complete it. And we don't believe they're onerous. They're a few hours for over 2 weeks. And that is to help you with respect to managing this part of maybe a CPD or a learning within your own professional context. The design of the MOOC is really, and it's around our wider design. If we move on to the next slide, please. The wider design of the MOOC really is there to provoke discussion, to understand the context, to explore our examples, and then answer key questions. And I think really trying to do that, we found that that might be the best way to engage our learners who will engage in the MOOC, but also would be most useful, and that you could see which you could be there as a participant in the MOOC, ask a question and have one of the DIGI-HE members come on and respond back to your question, but also to support that peer collaboration. So it's based in a framework of the conversational theory, really to get people to engage and to try and understand and their own context, but also to work through other contexts. And we've ran the MOOC since January 30th, and we'll keep running it, and it'll be available. So please do go in, it's open and available there. And we facilitated it over the last 2 weeks, and we'll continue to provide some form of facilitation over the next few months to respond to questions, to ensure that DIGI-HE the DIGI-HE institutions and the consortium is providing some support. So we will be withdrawing that for a little bit of time. So if we move to the next slide, One of the elements that we brought into the MOOC was this notion of the toolkit. And exactly, this is really just the starter pack nearly of getting you engaged with digital self-assessment, working out what are the key questions, the why, the what, and the how of doing it. And we look from things, the purpose of DELT, the context, the stakeholder process, hugely important, because we all know that, so I'm not going to go particularly into it, how to operationalize it, how to measure your success, and then how to engage with that post-implementation or post-self-assessment process, self-reflection, so that you can understand better the process and how you arrived or achieved the results that you achieved in. Okay, we might move to the next slide. So we've had a small number of participants on it, and we hope to welcome more people on it after today, which we'd be delighted. So initial thoughts from learners are interesting, and what we can see. And again, it just reframes and brings back into our highlights to us what are some of the key questions for institutions. We had a poll in the MOOC regarding what are the key drivers of engaging in institutional assessment with respect to DELT. And I think if I had asked you to do the poll now, we would probably come up with the same results. A small number of learners, of course, a small sample, but again, it's improving student experience. So at the end of the day, all of our institutions, we're very much looking at our end users, the people that we want to impact the most through their university experience. And this is really, really important for them, obviously, because independent of the COVID pendulum swing, as I call it, in some ways, where institutions went, to digital and then have swung back to place-based or face-to-face teaching. There's now sort of a bottom-up demand coming from a lot of students across Europe saying, potentially we want to engage with more digitally enhanced learning and teaching based on what they engage through COVID and what they currently have and where they see it. So maybe the crack that COVID has provided in the glass is a really, really important crack, and lots of students want that. So when we're, as institutions, are looking at that, we need to think about how that is going to impact their experience. The second most prevalent reason was to prepare for lifelong learning pathways. Really, really important. So there's an understanding within institutions that, moving back into pure face-to-face interactions with students is not necessarily going to stay with the students. We know that digital is part of the life, it's part of their mainstream. So for institutions, we're talking about mainstreaming DELT. It's mainstreamed in so many of our students' lives. So we need to understand that. So again, helping them and supporting them on their lifelong learning pathway is indeed something that we need to take, and perhaps a competence now that we're building. So it's learning to learn in a digitally enhanced way throughout the life cycle, which is an important part. So we might just move on to the next slide, please. And I just make sure I'm on the slides and the next one. I've gone on a little bit ahead, and you can see there the poll is up. So the two main reasons just are coming up. And you might move to the next slide for me, please. So some of the points that we've got from our learners, and this is one of our learners, I think many institutions will be playing catch up for a few years. We had no choice but to embrace digital education over the pandemic, and we experienced the benefits. There's definitely a willingness there now to continue embedding learning technologies and not to return completely to pre-pandemic practices entirely. So now organizations have to put the appropriate governance structures and resources in place to support and quality assure this change as it's happening. Interesting times is the comment from this learner. So again, Alison referenced some of the quality assurance aspects with respect to DELT and the tools and how they were important. And you can see that increasingly what's coming out from Europe centrally, looking at the digital benchmarks, looking at the ESGs and the concept of digital education. A lot of things are happening, and of course within various states. So it's a really, really important aspect now. So to use that momentum of that's come back into the place. So if we move on to the next slide, please, and I just make sure that we're moving along nicely. This learner here says, and again, this is a really, really interesting thing for me, particularly, teachers as digital citizens or immigrants. I belong to a generation of teachers that used to work with cassettes and CD players. So I'm not a digital citizen, I'm an immigrant. This is, a learner describing themselves. And we live in a digital teaching and learning world. That is the reason why I'm interested in studying this course. So again, at the coalface, and we know, independent of COVID or asynchronous learning or all that, the presence of the teacher's role is hugely important, and we shouldn't forget this. So again, in our institutional self-assessment, looking at those as a key stakeholder, as a key conduit of how this happens. So many institutions, you know, there will be teaching is really within the domain of the individual academic or teacher, and therefore there may not be so much scrutiny going on as to what happens in that learning environment, whether that's in the classroom or whether it's in a hybrid situation or a fully online. So dependent on that, how do institutions guide those type of experiences, and how do they develop them through? And that could be one of the main reasons that an institution would like to engage with digital self-assessment, to really understand how those experiences are being manifested at the coalface from the student perspective, but also from a teacher perspective. You know, most of us have learned in a particular environment. We've learned from a face-to-face. So how do we translate and update our own practices, our own CPD, our own professional development from a teaching context? And I say that as an academic and as a teacher. How do we do that, and how do we ensure that we're supporting and delivering for our students at the end of the day? So again, really, really important reasons to engage in self-assessment. So just move on to the next slide, please. So again, this is coming from a quality coordinator who's engaged with the course. I work as a quality coordinator at my university. Among many things related or unrelated to digital learning, we are right now looking into how we can improve to support our teachers on their way of learning or enhancing their digital education skills. So again, when we think about emergency or remote teaching, we think of lots, and when you've done studies, what's coming back from the research and the literature, we know that a lot of that has been transmission based. So it's been emergency remote teaching. So how to support a more nuanced engagement and nuanced enhancement as we forward to improve the learning experience. And I think one of the feedback we had from our consortium meeting last month in Brussels with the consortium is that lots of institutions now are not only talking about DELT in the context of a hybrid situation, but talking about it in respect to the face-to-face and to the the student engagement in those contexts as well. So I think that's an important aspect to it. So moving on to the next slide, please. And we're just coming towards the end. So what we see is that there's a huge amount of research that's been done in this area with respect to all the variety, and it transects a lot of the research in different areas, whether that's organizational change, whether it's talking about digital transformation, whether we're talking about enhancement of student learning, etc. There's a huge amount of literature that it intersects with. But we understand that, and we've hoped that through this MOOC that we're providing an opportunity for practitioners and those who are leading out on these changes, where they will have an opportunity to engage with each other and with the resources that we have developed throughout this project, which spanned a very interesting times. We know, and we have suggested here, that DELT processes are invariably multidimensional. They are, because they're pervasive now across institutions. It's not within one particular domain. It's not just within the teaching and learning category. It's pervasive. It's moved across into organizational structures, into into hiring. It will also move across into other aspects. So we need to think about that, and we need to see how, as institutions, we can build for the future, particularly if we take it on board that we are going to enhance the student learning experience, which is that digitally mainstreamed life which they all seem to be living. Must not be sick from wider practices. So again, I've skipped over one there, which is success is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. But success, of course, is, and it's part of the process of institutional self-assessment, is understanding why you're doing it and what means success in your situation, in your institutional context, and being really clear about that, because one institutional context may be quite different from another. So if you are already a very online institution, what you could be focusing on in that respect could be completely different to a larger institution who has multiple face-to-face enrollments, but understands or wants to particularly progress in a very particular way with respect to their engagement with DELT. So again, we've just drawn on a little bit of the literature here, just to say that these are not segregated practices, that they're in the that it's wider, they're entangled, and therefore the approach needs to be nuanced. It needs to be considered, and we hope that through this MOOC and through the other resources of the DIGI-HE project that we have provide some guidance and support for institutions as they engage with this. So then finally, if we move on to the last slide, a big Gura Mahagwiv, thank you very much. And the QR code is there, and I know Alison will have the link put into the chat for you and available, but I'm really, really happy to talk to any questions. If you can't find the MOOC, all you need to do is Google self-assessment, FutureLearn, DCU, and you'll get to it there as well. So please, we'll be looking forward for your comments and participation within the course. And thank you very much. I'll hand back to Alison.
Thank you, Mairéad, for that presentation. And yes, I see that we have some questions in the chat and hopefully enough time to get through them all. So some of the questions are quite practical in nature, others are a little bit more, let's say, about the self-assessment process in general. Let's maybe start with the kind of MOOC-related questions, seeing as you've just finished your presentation on that. So first of all, we have a question here about whether or not the MOOC provides toolkits or templates of what an exemplary digital learning strategy or virtual learning environment might look like. So you might have mentioned that already, Mairéad, but I'll let you just repeat for us.
Yeah, so we do provide a toolkit to support institutions to get on, to start that process of developing their own roadmap for self-assessment. We focus in on 5 key areas. So therefore, what we're trying to do is to have done a sort of a simple distillation of all the tools and try to come down with 5 categorical areas where you can sort of use that as part of it. I think from our own perspective, I think the case studies also provide a huge insight for institutions engaging with it. So again, looking at the variety of case studies, there's emphasis on different areas of self-assessment. And I think that's a really, really important part of learning and how to do it. And when you go back to the self-assessment tools, a lot of them provide those templates. So we've linked out to a lot of those and we've provided information in those. And also I think through the reports, etc., you can see some of that as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
If I could come in here, I think that's really important. So there's the toolkit, there is the analysis of self-evaluation tools, but then in addition, we have 3 to 4 concrete cases of institutions. Your own institution, Mairéad, DCU, is one of them, which shares practical experiences that they had with implementing or with using such tools and assess on how that worked for them. Maybe I can tie in here then another question, because there was the question, who is actually in charge for this self-review, self-assessment within the institution, Mairéad?
So who is in charge in our institution? Or in all institutions?
I mean, generally, what is the recommendation? Who did it at DCU? What is recommended? I think we have an answer for that.
We had buy-in from senior leadership. We took a approach to this, which was we had one of our senior leaders be the sponsor of it, and then we developed out a committee who had it. So we brought in a lot of stakeholders from the start to develop through the process, and we're guided through that. And actually we linked it into a quality assurance process that we were engaged in, a thematic review on digital learning within our institution. But then when we started to unpick this, we knew that it was so much more wider than just a simple digital learning review. So it became something that was quite useful, and we used multiple methods. So we used the CODA benchmarks, and then we used other we developed our own tool, our own frameworks then to engage. We had a bespoke platform that we used, communication platform called Fuse, which was now developed within the institution. And within that, we we engaged with the community in different ways, because there's so many communities that we needed to, from an institutional perspective, from professional services units to those engaged in academic, to the digitally enhanced learning teaching support, and then to our external stakeholders as well, whether that's in Ireland. So we try to involve those stakeholders through this process and to give them an opportunity then to respond and reflect into the issues and things that they saw. But generally, from my own experience of engaging and being an assessor on the other side of it, coming in and do those assessments, really, really important to see both a meeting of the bottom up and the top down. But I think without the top leadership, it's really, I think you will get through a process of self-assessment, but then what comes after, then it might just be one of those lovely reports that hangs or stays in a filing cabinet or whatever. So yeah, that would be my own personal opinion on that.
I think that's also the experience that we had throughout the project, and this is also quite evident from the case studies that we presented. I mean, we have different institutions from different countries. We had a UK case, we had a Finnish case, a case from Lithuania. And what you can see there, they do it all very differently. I mean, obviously, because they have different cultures, different academic cultures as well, different social cultures. But what you just said is really important. So you can't do it without the leadership support and without leadership, full stop. But you also need to involve staff and students across the institution. You also mentioned another point that I think is really important, also because there was here about a template and I mean, you can look at these tools, and you just said it, Mairéad, you can look at them and you say, oh, this is not really what I'm looking for. Parts of it I might use, but not the whole thing. And then you can add your own. Even if in the end you decide not to use it at all, it might be useful to look at what others have done. There went quite a lot of work in these tools, so they are at least thoroughly reflected, most of them, and one could use that when starting, even if you decide to build your own approach. Yeah.
Thanks, Mhichíl, and thanks, Mairéad. There are a few more questions in the chat. Just a few practical ones that maybe I could ask Mairéad, seeing as they're on the MOOC. So they're just wondering if there are any synchronous activities for participants on the MOOC, and whether or not you define indicators within your assessment guide.
Okay, so with respect to synchronous opportunities, what we decided on, we were going to include synchronous opportunities, but then we decided to have this as one of the synchronous opportunities. So at present we haven't, but I think it's a really good idea. I think that that's the beauty of having the MOOC format, is that you can add into it. And again, it's something that we can design into it again. I think for us, it's getting the richness of the engagement and then seeing what are the main issues for institutions, and also then seeing where is the demand, what is the particular point, what is it about the impact, and coming back to indicators. Is it the issue of impact that's important? So is there something that we need to support potentially learners in? But again, that's where the dynamic element and the iterative nature of the design of the MOOC is really, really important. So we'll be going back in, we'll be looking at this. And if we see that there's a demand for something, again, of course, we can develop that out. But again, it's designed to be asynchronous, it's designed to be self-paced, but it's also designed to be engagement between peers who are there to collaborate, who are there to support each other and there to understand each other's context. With respect to the indicator question, again, we took a decision about indicators and we said, well, you know, you can take out indicators and you can break them down into a whole range of ones that make sense for generically, but actually, as many institutions know, once your indicator has to mean something to you in your own context. So therefore, developing out an indicator set, which is your own institutionally focused ones, comes with a lot of those tools anyway. A lot of those tools will have them, so you can see them from those tools. But did we point to a particular set and say, this is the indicator set that all its self-assessment reviews? We didn't. In that. The other thing that I just want to pick up before we leave is that we've had inputs from a huge number of people on the MOOC on how it was developed, from our advisory board, from that. And everybody brings a different perspective onto this. And I think when engaged with this notion of self-assessment or process of self-assessment, I think that's one of the things that's really, really important. And for me, it's the reason, the why you do it is so, so important. And that feeds back in. So just, if we haven't said it before, a big thank you to all of those who've engaged with the design of it. And I'm talking about all of our DIGI-HE collaborators, but also we hope that will be you. We hope that when you provide us with your engagement and feedback, then we can go back in and look at, okay, whether we need to add in some more or add in less, or potentially source out some new things. So your feedback, you're also there as co-constructors of this process, which has been something that we've tried to inculcate in all of our activities within the DIGI-HE project.
There's one, thank you for that, Mairéad. There is one other really interesting question, I think, in the chat. If we could maybe quickly answer it, either maybe Mhichíl, you'd like to come in there, or Mairéad. They're asking whether, the evaluation of digital education is linked in any way to non-digital education. Would you like to take that one, Mhichíl?
That's a really interesting one, and I will ask also Mairéad what she thinks about it. But I mean, from our point, of course it is, and this is what I said at the start of this webinar. We had always thought that they should be go together. Actually, if you think it's silly to divide into learning and teaching and digital learning and teaching, you also don't single out book learning, for example. You know, it's learning, and so it could go together. And I think increasingly we are getting there. So I think many of the things that we say about digitally enhanced teaching and learning, they go equally for learning and teaching. So what you just described, Mairéad, about the process that you had of consultation, leadership, taking action, and that's not just on digital, it's on learning and teaching in general. But I mean, maybe you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I in the main agree with you, Mhichíl. I think for what we're looking to and what's needed, I think across institutions at the minute, you can see where, you know, we've talked about, and I referenced this bit when I was speaking earlier on, is that the issues of student engagement is an issue of student engagement, whether it's in something where we call it digitally enhanced, or whether it's in a face-to-face. And we know where institutions are struggling to get students back in, and there's demand coming from students saying, well, actually, can you not just provide that lecture online and I'll be fine? But the issues are still the same. So there's a lot of transcending issues around student engagement, about participation, experience, that transcends the mode of delivery. And I think for me, a lot of this, you know, we used to say when we were part of the discussions here in DCU and our research, when are we going to get to a point where it's post-digital? Where we're not talking about digital anymore, it's just education learning, and that digital is part of that, because I find it quite difficult to see a situation, even when you talk about some of the older institutions who work on tutor-based formats, etc. It's very rare, independent of whether it's the formalized learning experience or the informal learning experience, to see students who walk around with computers in their hands every day not to be using those in some sort of part of their learning experiences, whether that transcends both the formal and the informal.
I think we saw it already in the second round of, in the first and in the second round of learning and teaching thematic peer groups that we had. I mean, you don't discuss well-being of staff and students, which was one of the topics, only in the digital context, but it also matters when you are on campus, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that when we spoke about, and we know that during the COVID pandemic, we did a MOOC for students to get them over the digital divide, we called it, sort of thing. And it was really, really interesting, because we followed up with students, we've done sentiment analysis with them, and the strategies that they're using that they were taught, and worked with them. It was students for students. It was really, really interesting. But those strategies transcend. And again, it's not just limited to one context, because unfortunately we all live in this, I hate to say it, the multiverse, which includes both the reality of our day to day. And I always think about when people talk about virtual realities. Well, I'm living my life now, even though I'm online. So I'm not, there's nothing virtual. It's quite real reality for me here and now.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, a big thank you to both of you for your input. A big thank you to all the participants for attending. We've just gone 1 minute over. I hope that's okay, but I see that people are already leaving. So I think we'll wrap up there. And just my final kind of request is that you sign up for the MOOC. We have put it in the chat on a few occasions. But we will be sharing the QR code and the link again to sign up in a post-webinar email as well. So yeah, thanks to everyone involved, and we look forward to welcoming you on FutureLearn, hopefully to take part in the MOOC.
Happy St. Valentine's Day, Sarange.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.